Good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm Paul Clark and welcome to my studio. Now, what have I got for you lovely lot today? Well, from my recent tutorial on painting with black watercolour paper, loads of you requested a tutorial on using gouache. So, before we start, just a short announcement. There won't be a tutorial for the next 2 weeks because we're off teaching in La Gomera. In fact, at the time of this video going out, we're actually there at the moment, if that makes sense. Anyway, because of that, I've got 3 paintings for you today, all using gouache. So the first one is using it in the traditional watercolour way for this lovely seascape. And the next one is very much in the style of oil paint, so nice and thick and gooey in that impasto style. And then finally, I'm going to do it in that flat illustration style, very much how they used to paint those railway posters of the 1930s. So come and join me and we'll paint all 3 step by step together. So what is gouache? Now, it's often known as opaque watercolour, and here's the dictionary definition. A painting technique using an opaque watercolour paint in which the pigments are bound with glue and the lighter tones contain white. Well, I'm not sure about the glue, but it does contain most of the ingredients of watercolour, including the pigment, water, the binding agent, usually gum arabic, and in some paints, chalk is added to give the paint extra body. Now, one of the advantages it does have over watercolour is how opaque it is, so you're able to paint one colour on top of another, but that only happens after it's dried. Now, I don't profess to be a gouache technical expert, but before I fell in love with watercolour, I used to do all my work as a commercial illustrator in gouache, so I do have a fair amount of knowledge when it comes to using it practically. But if you're interested in knowing more about gouache, I would recommend 2 YouTube channels, the brilliant artist James Gurney and another American artist based in Scotland, Sarah Burns. Regarding the paints, most of the big manufacturers have a range of gouache, and I've always found that the Winsor Newton colours to be very reliable. But for this tutorial, I've invested in this 8-tube set by Royal Talens. The tubes are slightly bigger at 20 ml, but what I like about these is that as well as a black and white, they also include both a warm and cool set of primaries, so we should be able to mix up every colour in the world. So I'm making up a palette especially for this set. Right, for demo number 1, I'm going to be using the paint exactly as I would a normal watercolour. So I'm going to be using this Hahnemühle 300-pound watercolour block, and it's in a cold press finish. Off we go! And as I said, I'm using the gouache as if it's watercolour. So I'm starting by wetting the complete sheet with clean water. Now, I've done a very basic sketch, but this is going to be one of my spontaneous paintings where I don't really have a plan, but I'm just going to see where the paint takes me. Now, I'm using all the paint with a lot of water. And as I'm just using the 3 primary colours, there are far too many mixes to list them all. And sometimes I just simply pick up unexpected colours on my brush. Here I'm diagonally tilting my paper to get some movement in the sky. Dry off with a tissue and lift out some light with a damp brush. Now, the extraordinary thing here is, although the paint has a slightly grainier feel to it, it really does behave very much like traditional watercolour. And I'm able to use all my usual techniques of splattering and dropping in clean water and letting all the colours mix and blend on the paper. Now if you're having a go at this, don't be afraid to mix your own colours and just experiment with the paint. And this is definitely one that you can try if you don't have any gouache. Just use your watercolours. Now I think with water like this little stream here, some vertical bands of colour painted in wet always gives the idea of reflected water. Let's stick in an old fence here with my rigger brush. Some thick white gouache here at the end to give a little touch of dazzling light. And we're all done in just under an hour. So next we're going to use gouache in a thick oil painting style and try and get that impasto technique great artists like Van Gogh used so well. So for this I'm using the same paper as previous, and I'm going to start by knocking back the white paper with a ground colour similar to that of yellow ochre. Now obviously let that totally dry. Next I'm doing a quick sketch of a riverbank, and again this is a painting I don't actually have any reference for, so we'll just see what happens. So I'm adding a lot of white for these pale colours, and it's worth remembering with gouache that most colours will dry a good 10% darker, unlike watercolour which always dries lighter. Now all my greens are mixed from the 2 yellows and ultramarine, and again there are far too many mixes to list them all, and I'm also picking up a lot of random colour from my brush anyway. Now I'm really using a very thick consistency of paint, only adding in a touch of water and sometimes adding in no water at all, and I'm using my big flat brush for this. Here a bit of smudging with my finger. And using my flat brush here I can pick up a bit of dry brush texture. So a lot of white in this mix to keep it good and opaque. And using the side of my flat brush for this foliage effect. Back to my number 12 brush here. Now things are all looking a bit too green, so I'm adding in a little touch of warmth value with some browns. So for those of you who've crossed over to the dark side and use oils and acrylics, you'll see that many of these techniques are very similar. And this is definitely one of the main advantages in painting with solid body colour, is something like this light value tree can be painted directly on top whereas in watercolour we would have had to have painted around it, just leaving the space. Here I'm just softening some of these reflections with some clean water. Of course, even my gouache paintings have to have a little splattering. Now some thick white gouache straight from the tube, and this is where I'm trying to get that really thick impasto effect. I have to say that I've not painted this way for absolutely years, but I really enjoyed it. And don't forget, unlike acrylics, you can re-wet your paints when dried and use them again and again. final touches with my rigger. And we're done. Great fun. Okay, so for the final tutorial, using gouache as flat body colour. So here's my reference that I got from Google Street View, and it's down at Robin Hood's Bay in North Yorkshire. Now, I've always loved those old 1930s British Rail posters advertising resorts to visit by train. The way the artists use big flat blocks of colour all gives it that lovely graphic illustrative feel. So I thought we'd have a go at creating one ourselves, and gouache being the perfect medium. Okay, so for this tutorial I'm using some Langton cold press watercolour board, but any decent watercolour paper will do. So here is my pencil drawing, and this one is free to download from my website, link in the description below. So let me talk about the best paint consistency for getting a good flat coverage. So it's a very creamy mix, and I would say it's about 60% paint, 40% water. So I'm using my number 12 brush and trying to get the most even spread of paint possible. And then when I've blocked in the large areas, I swap to my number 6 brush. Now this small section is filmed in real time, so you can see how long this tutorial could possibly take. In fact, the whole painting took nearly 5 hours in total, so a time lapse is definitely needed. So I'm going to be speeding this up by at least 8 times. Now again, all my colours are mixed from the 3 primaries plus the white and black, so there's far too many colours to list them all, but of course you can make it your own with any colours you wish. Now, one of the biggest challenges is getting the values right, because it can be quite a surprise seeing the colours drying at least 10 to 15% darker. So in some of the lighter colours I'm adding in quite a bit more white than you might expect. Now if you like to work in acrylics, then this project will also work very well. Just try and keep the paint consistently flat as possible. What's this strange red brush, I hear you say? It's not one of yours. Don't know, I must have just picked it up by mistake. Now, sometimes a little bit of purple can look really effective in your shadows. Okay, so here is a classic example of misjudging the colour when it's dried. This time it's not quite dark enough, so I'm repainting, adding in a little touch more black. Okay, for these cobbles I want to mix up the colours a bit and also add in some lighter values for interest. Now for these window frames I'm using my trusty number 3 rigger to get those really fine lines. Just these little figures to do now. There we go, all done. All we need to do now is to add a little bit of 1930s graphics. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did and you give all 3 of them a go. Even if you haven't got any gouache paints, you can use acrylic or even try it with watercolour. So please don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment, even though I won't be able to respond to any of them for at least 3 weeks as we're sunning it over in La Gomera. Anyway, look forward to seeing you then. Have a great time. Bye for now.